Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Blockmans. I'll be moderating this webinar. We'll just wait a few seconds for people to stream into the virtual audience. See the numbers picking up. And then we'll kick off in a few seconds to a minute. Right. Good morning, everyone. As said, my name is Stephen Blockmans. I'm Senior Research Fellow both at CEPS in Brussels as well as ICDS in Tallinn, and a coordinator of Reunir, which is a Horizon Europe funded project by the European Commission that looks into future proofing or ways to future proof the toolboxes of the European Union in support of candidate countries in the face of growing malign interferences in what should be their strategic direction towards the European Union. And in a way, this project offers a natural context for a discussion on EU enlargement, which is generally lauded as one of the foreign policies, perhaps the most effective one, but lauded primarily for its transformational qualities. And it seems appropriate, therefore, at the eve of the 20th anniversary of the fifth round of EU enlargement, which was the largest to date, with 8 countries of Central and Eastern Europe and 2 Mediterranean countries, Cyprus and Malta, joining to reflect on what has gone well, what has perhaps not gone that well, in order to tease out lessons for the future. We know that the European Union is again in enlargement mode, triggered by the membership application by Ukraine, quickly followed by those by Moldova and Georgia, and thereby also re-energizing the enlargement process for the Western Balkans. The question is whether that momentum can be kept up now that geopolitical decisions have been taken and the process moves into more bureaucratic channels, which forcibly will be a bit longer. And so to discuss all of this, we have invited Michael Emerson, who's a senior associate research fellow at CEPS and former ambassador for the European Commission at the time in Moscow, to present first a co-authored paper with Daniel Gross on the economic impact of EU enlargement, taken together with his own work then on the democratic transformational elements over the last 20 years of EU enlargement, and to hear from Christy Reich, Deputy Director at ICDS, the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, not just her personal experience, of course, from Estonia, the wider Baltics, as indeed Central and Eastern Europe, but also to hear from her on those her own reflections on the economic and political transformation of her country and those in Central and Eastern Europe. After which we will hear from Professor Stéphanie Lawley-Chailloux, who is a professor of European law and reform at the University of Central Lancashire in Cyprus, from her own vantage point. Unfortunately, Stéphanie's camera is not functioning this morning, so we will have to do with her name only on the screen, but the audio is working perfectly well. With that, Michael, can I invite you to offer your initial reflections on the 20th anniversary and its supposedly transformational character?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm honored to get started on this. I will be coming to the enlargement question, the next enlargement question, but I want to place it all in the context of the contest between democracy and autocracy, which is raging out there in the world and impacts Europe and the European Union in various ways, which I will come to. Now, template for my analysis. In 1922, the eminent Belgian historian Henri Pirenne published an article entitled Mahomet et Charlemagne. And he created quite a stir amongst academic historians, famously arguing at that time how the rise of Charlemagne as defender of Europe's Christian identity some 1200 years ago would have been inconceivable without the Arab aggression. Now, translated in terms relevant for today, identity there was standing for the coalescence of the Christian identity then, but identity was standing for the coalescence of society's perceptions of its beliefs and values, enhanced to the point of enabling a previously impossible mobilization of power to defend itself against the external threat. So translated more directly into the current context, the question is whether democratic Europe and the EU in particular can, in current circumstances with the multiple global crises and the advance of autocracy in the world at large, whether the EU can crystallize a sufficiently strengthened sense of European democratic and geopolitical identity to enable the organization of the means to defend itself, first of all, against the aggressive Russian autocracy on its doorstep. So my remarks will proceed as follows. First, I put basic facts on the table, basic democracy, autocracy facts, and also macroeconomic trends in relation to the last enlargement. Second, now the trickier question, why has autocracy been advancing in the world at large? And third, paradoxically, how the EU has been responding to the driving forces behind autocracy in enhancing its own democratic and geopolitical identity. But fourth, how the EU needs still to do more to face up to the external threats from the autocracies. And finally, the conclusion in relation to the Pirenne template. So now on the facts and figures. First slide, please. Okay, democracy and autocracy in the world. This remarkable graph taken from the Varieties of Democracy project shows China as the baseline autocracy, not moving at all. Russia, having had a jump up in democratic practice immediately after its independence in 1991-92, plunging down now towards absolute autocracy. And then the fascinating Indian case, which upon independence around 48, 50, saw remarkable advance in democratic institutions and practice, which was sustained until very recently with the Modi administration, where, notwithstanding the current spectacular election going on, the quality of Indian democracy has been plunging down. Next slide, please. Now, the European story. In red there, first of all, Western Europe, and the blue is East and Central Europe. Here, over the same time span, you can see the strong advance of democracy in Western Europe, with the first jump up, interestingly, in 1848, with the revolutions of that time, continuing trend advance, but then the disturbances of the world wars. Around the First World War, with the end to the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, there was the sudden emergence of quite a number of new sovereign nation states, which were initially quite democratic. Then, of course, for Western Europe, the interwar period with the fascist interlude, but then after the Second World War, the resumption of the quality of democracy in Western Europe reaching its present very high, if not entirely perfect levels. So that's the West European story and basically the EU story. For East and Central Europe, again, the dissolution of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires saw a surge up in democratic practice, but then plunged down with the fascism of the interwar period, which then passed over to the Stalinist autocracy, communist autocracy, which lasted, of course, until 1990, when democratic practice was re-established. But there you see some deterioration in the quality in recent years. Next slide, please. Here's the European story more precisely. So the top line is the EU member states before the 2004 enlargement. I mean, high quality democracies almost without exception. Then the exceeding candidates in 2004, and then and subsequently Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. Very interestingly, intriguingly, surging improvements in the quality of democracy up until 2005, after the Big Bang had happened, and then some relapse. And then, interestingly, in the third line, the current EU candidates, basically the nines, 6 Western Balkans and 3 East Europeans, they also were improving up until the same breakpoint, but then stopped improving. And then the bottom graphs are the former Soviet states, Central Asia, Russia, and the other Eastern Partnership states, not candidates, all plunging down into autocracy. There's a little Armenian, slightly different story in there, hidden in the third, in the certain line. But basically, this is the chasm between democratizing Europe and autocratizing Europe. Next slide, please. Now, this comes to the break point as to whether the end to the improvement of democracy in the newly exceeding states of 2004 was because the pressure was off, the EU pressure was off, and they could relax. Here, interestingly, one can see that there's the same break point observable in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Middle East and North Africa, which is telling us then that there are global factors at work in addition, to which I'll be returning in a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, just a couple of slides on the macroeconomics of the big enlargement, including here the case of Romania and, by the way, Turkey, which have been rapidly catching up on EU GDP per capita standards. Romania is taken here as just one case, but the Polish example is basically the same trajectory, and all of the other acceding candidates are on the same trend, but maybe a little less strongly. And then the interesting point here is to notice that if one makes the US comparison with its neighbors, Mexico and Central America, no such convergence has been happening, nor indeed has there been any convergence in Middle East and North Africa on the Euro area. Next slide, please. And here's the Western Balkans, following the same impressive catch-up story on the Euro area, way behind Poland and Hungary, but still catching up quite fast. Okay, that's the end to the slideshows. The story then is, could we remove the slides, please? Thank you. So the big stories here are, first of all, the big enlargement of 2004 has been unambiguously successful with respect to the macroeconomics of catch-up. So I'm not going to say any more about that. Good show. The politics of it, however, are much more complicated and directly leading into the key issue we are discussing here as to how to cope with the autocratic aggression from Russia. So the question is, why has autocracy been advancing in the world in the last couple of decades? Indeed, since that breakpoint, that coincidental breakpoint with the big enlargement of 2004. Our colleague and friend Richard Youngs has a forthcoming book in which he sets out, I find, a rather convincing explanation with the aid of 4 factors explaining the deteriorating global reputation of the West and its liberal democratic order. He has 4 points. 1, climate. The global South blames the West for having caused global warming with reason, but this is aggravated with some trade sanctions now from the EU against insufficiently green partners in the developing world. In addition, the West has been slow in meeting its financial pledges, while at the same time China is offering very cheap solar power to everybody. Second point, the COVID pandemic, immunization leading to increased centralized powers, then in the case of China, with a further advance of the electronic surveillance state, with the global South criticizing the West for hogging vaccines. Third, macroeconomic disorders. The financial crisis from New York in 2008, coupled to glaring inequalities between West and South, and conspicuously within the US itself, alongside austerity policies administered by the IMF, all hurting the reputation of the democratic West, its neoliberal order and Washington consensus. Fourth point, the rise of China, its power and influence with the Belt and Road funding with no political questions asked, complemented by Russia at the lowest level of international relations in using its militias to prop up Sahel region putschists, kicking out the US and France, to which we may add Donald Trump, who further damages the reputation of Western democracy while encouraging Putin famously to do what the hell he likes in European NATO states, not paying enough for their defense. Now, the big paradox is how the EU has actually been shaping up its identity, powers, resilience, in response to these same four global phenomena. First, climate. EU has made major advances in its regulatory powers to combat global warming, with growing activism also at local levels with citizens' initiatives, thus its green democratic identity. The COVID pandemic, EU created a new public health competence for vaccine procurement with equal treatment for all citizens and member states, plus now the Recovery and Resilience Facility, in which it mobilized 750 billion euro as a huge act of financial solidarity. And then the macroeconomic disorders. Well, the EU had to face up to its Greek euro crisis, but could mobilize 450 billion euro to prevent wreckage of the eurozone. The EU has had to face up to its own austerity policy critique and ongoing political debate, but one in which the eurozone has come to allow some greater flexibility. But most important, European social policies compared to those of the grotesque inequalities in the Europe maintains its universal welfare state and fiscal redistribution to moderate income inequalities. The fourth, the new geopolitics. Now, the EU has got round to pronouncing geopolitical rhetoric, but it so far is rather weak in substance and impact behind that rhetoric. There is large-scale financial assistance to Ukraine, but only limited military aid by the EU and its member states combined. Now, which now leads us on into the question how to consolidate and secure the map of democratic political Europe under two further headings. This indeed now is the next enlargement question. This enlargement, next enlargement, if it happens, is categorically different to the 2004 enlargement because it has become a geopolitical imperative to mark out the map of democratic Europe with no gray area between it and Russia becomes the imperative. Enlargement has now become a security project on top of its political values and economic content. But the current enlargement process is stagnant and stuck. And behind the technicalities of it, there is political ambiguity between member states blocking the process. Now, the blockage would have to be overcome with reform of the enlargement methodology. The means to do this have been identified under the now familiar term of staged succession, to which Stephen and I have contributed. But the most justified reservations of member states about a next enlargement is the fear that the new and fragile democracies of the candidate states may result in even more Orban type problems for the cohesive governance of the EU. Now, the technical means to overcome precisely this are identified and could be taken up under either of three formulations. One, no veto powers for the new member states transitionally, or a reformed Article 7 of the treaty suspending all voting powers for those member states or a member state in serious breach of EU values, or a new category of associate membership to cover the time needed for the EU's own institutional reform and deepening to advance sufficiently. So the scene is set for a new enlargement, given the new candidate status and 50 billion euro of aid for Ukraine and the new growth plan for the Western Balkans. But reform of the enlargement methodology is not there yet, with the seemingly technical issues masking the lack of political will. Sixth and final point, European Defence Union. This can be used as the nameplate for getting serious about military defense. The Ukraine war has already stirred up first steps in supplying ammunition funded by the EU budget, ideas for integrating the industrial military complex are well under debate. The organization of a significant rapid deployment capacity is discussed. But more generally, the defense domain must now be ripe for the EU's tested method of systemic development, i.e., the setting of a long-term goal with short and medium-term plans for significant operational advances. And so, alongside the recent Letta report and forthcoming Draghi report, both on the economics of the EU, it is time for a landmark report for a European Defence Union. It is time to think through also how the war in Ukraine may end and its consequences for the EU and NATO. To take just one scenario, there could sometime next year maybe a ceasefire line and initially a North-South Korea type border while Putin remains. Moving on, years later, post-Putin, to something more like the North-South Cyprus model, on which Stephanie Chaloux may comment. For us here, the Cyprus model is standing for an open and peaceful border between North and South, with the South in the EU and the North protected by the big external power. And so the main point here is that with Putin still in power, the de facto border would have to be heavily defended, with EU membership at least in the pipeline for Ukraine and maybe for NATO too. So now the conclusion. Return to the beginning. The overarching question is whether the EU now approaches a new Piren moment in which Putin's aggression in Ukraine, the ominous rise of China, and the uncertain political reliability of the US combine to crystallize Europe's awareness of its unique democratic and geopolitical identity to the point of empowering a new will to defend it. its identity is indeed unique by virtue of its combination of values, ideas, and policies. Democracy, human rights, rule of law, of course, but then also social Europe with welfare state and fiscal distribution to avoid gross income inequalities, as in the US. Green Europe with both top level climate action and grassroots civil action. And then, as the supreme value, the eternal peace of Immanuel Kant, or as academic writings sometimes call it, zero threat perceptions, at least for the EU itself, and until recently taken for granted, but now attacked by Putin's Russia. It so happens that now is exactly the 300th anniversary in April 1724 of the birth of Immanuel Kant in today's Kaliningrad. His dream at last was seeming to come true after centuries in Europe of incessant war. But now is the awakening. The post-war peace in Europe was due to protection by an external power whose reliability is now in doubt, while the new aggression and threat have arrived. Could it be then that Putin, the absolute autocrat, in an analogy with Perrin's argument, may complete his career as midwife to Europe's full democratic and geopolitical identity, pour réunir l'Europe? Europe is not yet there, far from it, yet it has in its hands the potential in the driving forces we have discussed to maybe synergize them into the rare Pirenne model of political dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sketching out the mega trends that define the evolution of democracy, not just in Europe, as currently seen through the prism of the 2004 EU enlargement, but indeed more globally, and also pinpointing to the divergence in the economic sphere, which clearly does show a market success thanks to the enlargement move by the European Union. You mentioned Immanuel Kant and his and the 300th anniversary of his birth. There's also the 100th anniversary this year of the death of Franz Kafka, which of course casts a certain surrealism over the reintegration of Europe, as you say, in the face of revisionist actions by Putin or Putinist clones. And I wonder whether some of the notions or normative statements that you've put down are really shared by our commentators. Christy Reich will no doubt have some ideas about how different really the geopolitical imperative is of the current EU enlargement as opposed to the one from 2004. And I'm sure Stephanie Charlot will have her own perspective on that too. But I don't want to mow the grass in front of your feet, Christy. I'll be keen to hear also your personal perspective on how EU enlargement has worked or not from an Estonian perspective.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to Michael also for this very comprehensive overview. Greetings from Tallinn. So indeed, we are now celebrating 20 years of membership in the EU. And I have, of course, my personal memories of the celebrations 20 years ago, and a sense of deja vu, because 20 years ago and also today, the odd thing is that we are not really seeing that much of jubilant celebration in Tallinn or elsewhere in Estonia. So support for the EU is very high among Estonians, and it is very obvious that Estonia has benefited from EU membership in many ways. I will shortly give you some examples. But on the other hand, EU membership has always kind of had this kind of flip side in Estonians' minds. And the flip side is that there is kind of concern about limitations on national sovereignty that unavoidably come together with the EU membership. And when we had the referendum on Estonia's EU accession just over 20 years ago, it was actually preceded by very lively discussions, and it was not so evident that there would be very strong support. In the end, it was 63% of the voters voting in favor, but indeed the discussions were quite heated, and nothing could be kind of taken for granted. At the level of kind of foreign policy goals for Estonia, it was evident immediately after Estonia reestablished independence in 1991 that integration or reintegration to the West is the way to go and is the way to secure democracy, secure economic development, and also security and independence. So the three elements kind of always have been going hand in hand. And I think also when we talk about future enlargement of the EU today, again, all these three goals, I think, remain crucial, that we want to spread democracy, we want to spread welfare, and also to make Europe more secure, and then address the geopolitical challenges, which of course today are much more serious than they were 20 years ago. A couple of more words about Estonia's way to membership. Because many elements of the pre-accession process are still similar today to what they used to be before the Big Bang enlargement. And what was very clear for Estonia at the time of preparing and applying for membership was that you absolutely need to do your homework seriously. And it was especially important for the Baltic states because they really had to make an extra effort to convince the old member states that enlargement indeed had to be extended also to the three Baltic states, meaning the former Soviet republics. We don't like to be called with this name anymore, but there was this kind of mental barrier to be crossed. And so the feeling in Estonia was that we had to be better than Poland or better than Hungary in order to actually get to the goal of the EU accession. And so it was also very important to have a merit-based approach by the EU, meaning that the efforts that Estonia made actually did make a difference. And that every country was assessed according to its homework. And this is, I think, a principle that remains important today. It's part of the kind of credibility of the enlargement process. That there are membership criteria. These criteria are applied to every candidate country in the same way, and then there is objective assessment of the criteria. That's also the way to try to make sure that the EU will function well also after enlargement. But as Michael was also referring to, of course, there is no 100% guarantee of that. And I think one lesson we can draw from the 24 enlargement is that Although the countries that joined back then did meet the accession criteria, that was, it later turned out that was no guarantee that they would not experience some setbacks later on. And Hungary, of course, being the most obvious example of a country where we have seen backsliding of democracy and the rule of law. And this is something that kind of cannot be prevented from happening just by applying strict conditionality before accession. So we need to think of other instruments in the EU also to tackle problems with the rule of law in member states when they occur. Then looking at what has been achieved in the case of Estonia, okay, Michael made it very clear that enlargement has been a success story when you look at economic development of the new member states. Estonia is a very clear case of that. Just before EU accession in 2004, the level of Estonia's GDP was less than 50% of EU average at the time. And today, Estonia is close to 90% of EU average. And there is, I think, quite broad acceptance in Estonia that sooner or later, Estonia will actually become a net payer. It might happen after the next enlargement, but actually it will happen at some point in any case, hopefully, if we manage to keep up this speed of economic development that has been clearly faster than in the so-called old member states. Also, when it comes to democracy, rule of law, press freedom, different measurements, global comparisons really put Estonia in a very favorable position. And so it's one of the cases where one can say that EU membership has contributed to the consolidation of democracy. And we have also seen in Estonia the kind of rise of radical right populism to some extent, and we even had the experience of having radical right-wing populists in government for a couple of years, which then raised this question of whether we might face similar setbacks comparable to Poland and Hungary, but it didn't really materialize because the support of these radical parties was not so high. It has always remained maximum around 20% of the electorate. So in all, Estonia has been a success story in many ways. And now it is a very strong supporter of the next enlargement, and especially making efforts to support Ukraine. But of course, we are in a very different geopolitical environment today. Not that there was no geopolitical aspect to the previous enlargement, it was there also for Estonia. It was about also about security, not only about democracy and welfare. But of course, the level of threat was not comparable to what we see today. So, looking ahead now and thinking about the lessons learned from previous enlargement to the future one, there are certain points with regard to the enlargement policy, where I think I already mentioned the merit-based approach and having a credible prospect of membership, and then the point that candidate countries actually need to do their homework, but then they also need to be confident that once they do the homework, they do actually achieve membership. So that's I think one of the lessons. Then in terms of security, what I want to underline is that enlargement of the EU and NATO have moved hand in hand. And in the case of the Baltic states, it was actually surprising that NATO membership was achieved a little bit before EU membership. In the late 1990s, it seemed that NATO membership was a far more difficult goal to achieve, and seemed it would take longer. But having the two processes in parallel was so crucial, because it's still the situation today that it's NATO membership that kind of offers credible security guarantees to the member states. The EU does not have the instruments, the structures, the resources, the political will to do that. And although we have seen impressive new dynamics in the development of EU defense policy and defense cooperation and support to Ukraine, including military support, and we can speak about the emergence of a geopolitical EU, I think this certain division of labor between the EU and NATO is even clearer today than it was before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And this means that also in the case of Ukraine, Moldova, and other candidate countries, EU enlargement can be successful if it comes together with credible security guarantees for the new member states. And these cannot be provided by the EU. And I also want to just make a very short comment on what Michael said about prospects of the war in Ukraine. He was speaking about possible kind of ceasefire line being stabilized, and then mentioned these models of North-South Korea and North-South Cyprus. I think this is really the kind of biggest question for European security. What will be the outcome of the war in Ukraine? And I don't see kind of a credible solution of having a stabilized ceasefire and kind of accepting that Russia has partially achieved its goals by this illegal and brutal invasion. So we have to keep in mind that Ukraine has defined its strategic goal of victory against Russia, and it has been said by several Western leaders also that Russia must be defeated, it must be militarily defeated before we can be kind of confident that we can actually stabilize the situation with Ukraine. Russia must be militarily forced to give up its geopolitical ambitions regarding Ukraine. And so far, this is not happening. Russia has not redefined its strategic goals in any way, and it kind of constantly hopes that it will ultimately kind of outlast the West, and it will prevail, and it will be able to eventually achieve its goal of restoring its sphere of influence. So this is going to be a long fight, and we should not kind of pretend that there are easy solutions of achieving a stable ceasefire line next year and then moving ahead with Ukraine's accession to the EU. I'm afraid it takes a more serious military effort still from Ukraine with Western support before we can actually get there. Thanks.
Thank you, Chrissy, also for your retrospection and prospection. Your last comments, of course, provide a perfect segue to the experience with Cyprus. What I recall, and we may want to pick up on the discussion. And please, members of the audience, you can start typing your questions or observations in the chat box of Zoom. We'll bring them in and to our panelists. Please identify yourself as well as the person you would like to address a comment or question to. But what I recall in particular from your observations, Christy, is this tension that currently seems to dominate the enlargement process, geopolitical motives, need for speed in order to serve interests on both sides within the European Union, of course, candidate countries, and then a merit-based approach, conditionality, etc., where how that balance ought to be struck will be a key question going forward. Also, your appeal for more post-accession type of conditionality in the rule of law sphere brings back the point that Michael raised on the revision of Article 7 of the EU Treaty. And then, of course, your question, or rather statement, that the EU cannot, you do not believe at least, that the European Union can provide credible security guarantees to candidate countries, new member states, is something that people may want to take issue with. But these are some of the points that you raised, much more there. I pass on the floor to Stéphanie Lolet-Chaloux for her reactions to Michael's presentation and what you may have also heard from Christy. Stéphanie.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Michael and Christy, for this very interesting discussion. What I suggest I do is that I'm going to give you some thoughts, first of all, on the papers that are the main reason why we are here today. And then, yes, I will try to react to some of the points that were raised and try to advance the debate. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on the two papers, which I have enjoyed reading. And I have enjoyed in particular the way Michael was able to consolidate so much history and so much economics in a few pages. So I think that's very good. Starting with the first paper, which is by Michael, but also by Daniel Gross on microeconomics. I just wanted to add that it would make sense not to lose sight of the cases of Cyprus and Malta. So in other words, of the Mediterranean islands that joined in May 2004, which were economically prosperous already before their accession to the European Union, and whose case the macroeconomic benefits of EU membership were less pronounced than in the case of the Central Eastern European countries. So in other words, we would need to look for motivations to join the European Union elsewhere. The CEE countries have indeed seen their economic fortunes improve very considerably since their accession, and this is very clear in the paper, allowing them not only to catch up with the older EU member states, but in some cases to also overtake some older member states. In that sense, Cyprus and Malta are also outliers, just like some older member states such as Italy, Greece, Portugal, but they are so for different reasons. So we could come back to the case of Cyprus in particular, as this case is quite emblematic of European economic integration. Just to say a few words, because it seems to be of much interest to the current enlargement process as well. There were very few short-term financial benefits for Cyprus to join the European Union, so these were not really obvious at first sight. And since Cyprus joined as a divided island, actually, the Republic of Cyprus was a net receiver of net contributor of EU funds rather than anything else. So, but these are due partly also to the financial implications of having a divided island as a member state. The financial benefits, however, came soon afterwards. Post-Eurozone accession, we haven't really spoken much about the Eurozone today, but for a country like Cyprus, acceding the Eurozone very quickly was one of the main aims of the whole process. And these combined with the revisions of the EU treaties via the Treaty of Lisbon actually provided the cushion, or provided the shield to Cyprus for longer term financial assistance in the context of the sovereign debt crisis and the so-called bail-in or haircut in Cyprus. So, of course, it could be argued that being outside of the Eurozone for a country like Cyprus would have meant that more financial tools and instruments would have been available during the financial crisis. However, the fact that Cyprus joined the Eurozone very quickly, only 4 years within enlargement and within accession, meant that the assistance, the financial assistance available via EU and international mechanisms was well, close to nothing. There was nothing else equivalent available. Of course, the case of Cyprus is a tragic case in many different ways in terms of the financial crisis and the consequences of the financial crisis. But this idea of Europeanization is useful there as well, to think as to what would have happened in case Cyprus had not been a member of the Eurozone. And indicators are quite clear that the situation would have been even worse outside of the financial mechanisms available within the Eurozone to handle the financial crisis. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. So ironically, it is on the economic front that Cyprus was to benefit the most from its EU and Euro area membership, but let's say not in the most obvious way, or not in the most expected way, because it basically was between 2011 and 2013 that Cyprus faced a severe economic downturn, the root causes of which were actually quite largely unrelated to its EU participation. And the way out was via the solidarity of the EU and Euro area partners. Thanks to that, Cyprus was able to overcome a grave economic challenge at the point where it had actually lost access to the capital markets. And after third countries had refused to help finance Cyprus's way out of its twin fiscal and banking sector crisis. Let me just remind you that actually there was a loan from Russia not long before the bail-in. Cyprus soon returned to economic health, and it's currently playing a constructive role, not only on the economic front, but also on behalf of the EU as its advanced hearing and first response station in the Middle East. Maybe we can come back to this later on, since we have spoken quite a lot about geopolitics and security. But I would like to move on first, or secondly, let's say, to Michael's second paper, which is on democratic identity. This paper, I think, rightly touches on issues that are both and analytically very complex. I very much enjoyed looking at the broader picture, looking at the comparison, or let's say the spectrum between democracy and autocracy across the globe. The descent towards autocracy is sadly not the privilege of the BRICS and the countries of the global south. several European member states beyond the usual suspects, being Hungary and Poland, have been going through a deterioration of their performance in matters of rule of law and democracy. And these include countries such as Malta, Slovakia, and more recently Greece. Hence, both an older member state and two member states from the 2004 enlargement, of which one is a CEE country, where the other is not. Signs of a democratic backsliding and of a transition from genuinely liberal to mere electoral democracies can also be detected elsewhere in the EU, including Croatia and Slovenia, as reflected in the latest rule of law report of the European Commission and the related resolutions of the European Parliament. These trends are to be confirmed or not in 2024. We are waiting for the reports of the European Commission early summer 2024. There is no monosemantic explanation of this worrying phenomenon, and I think Michael offers quite a few very thorough and robust explanations in the paper, and again today. And I would argue that it would be odd if the trend towards more autocracy and less democracy were to only affect the countries of the global south, leaving Europe largely unaffected. Indeed, the signs are there that Europe is anything but unaffected, and this is something that gives us food for thought and further investigation. If we have a bit of time, we could discuss some of the initiatives we are taking under our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence for the Rule of Law and European Values, where we basically measure some aspects of the rule of law and democratic values in Europe. And we currently have surveys available for the general public, but also for professionals on various aspects of the rule of law, which perhaps I could share with Stephen later on. Before I go back to Cyprus, I wanted to say a few words about the methodology in the papers, which I thought were very interesting methodologies. I very much welcome the use in the papers of empirical data, in particular when it comes to measuring aspects of democracy and the rule of law, and link it to microeconomics and the way a particular phenomenon such as EU enlargement may be successful on the microeconomic perspective or side, but less successful on the democratic side. I think that this is quite useful in order to convey complex ideas and concepts and anchor them into global phenomena, such as the ones we've been discussing today, particularly climate justice, rule of law crises, public health disasters, wars, and sustainable development. In the papers, breakpoints appear that may explain democratic or undemocratic trends, but also the polarization of ideas, as well as blueprints where the EU ends up exercising what I call first-generation competence in times of crisis. And Michael has given a number of such first-generation competencies, if you wish, such as the green democratic identity, but also new public health competencies, as well as the new recovering fund as an act of financial solidarity. The mobilization to avoid the wreckage of the Eurozone is definitely another one, as well as the fact that the EU, despite all difficulties, tries to maintain universal welfare states and fights inequalities, as well as the new global security situation with limited but yet sustainable help to Ukraine. So I've used the word sustainable because I think that to address some of what Christy was saying as well, I think what we really need at this point, in addition to perhaps stronger conditionality on the rule of law, as was said before by Christy, is an approach to the rule of law that is actually one of sustainability of the rule of law itself. So it is in times of crisis and emergency situations that the proper application or the proper respect of the rule of law seems to be most at threat. So it is under those circumstances, including military circumstances, that the rule of law must stay afloat and must remain protected. Hence the word of sustainability, perhaps better suiting, as we do know that some leeways or some well, compromises will have to be made. So perhaps the word sustainability is a better word. We have been celebrating a number of European thinkers, such as Kafka or Kant. I just wanted to come back to the speech on Europe by President Macron that followed the speech on Europe by the President of the European Commission that was celebrating the 20 years of EU enlargement. President Macron, last week at his speech at La Sorbonne, borrowed from Paul Valéry in the context of the First World War and alleged that the EU is mortal. And I think again here, it's interesting to go back to the basic idea of Europeanization. In other words, the question is, could we have done things differently without the EU? What could have been the outcome? And I think that this is probably a timely answer in autocratic times, I would say, to think about a simple, basic concept like Europeanization. And since we are talking about Europeanization, let me just perhaps say a few words about Cyprus and how Cyprus could, if at all, be used as a precedent or as a model. Although I do share Christie's concerns about, actually getting to the point of talking about the ceasefire line. But before we ever get there, perhaps it would be interesting to reconsider why a country like Cyprus actually joined the European Union in the first place, as being something very different from the CEE countries in particular. So the considerations for Cyprus and for any country that would have been in Cyprus's situation, including a country like Ukraine, but also some of the Western Balkans, is security consideration and was security consideration over economic considerations. Of course, the difference is that Cyprus, economically speaking, was a strong country before it joined the European Union, and perhaps that is one of the main differences with the current candidate countries for enlargement. So, as I said, on entrance, Cyprus was a net contributor. So financial interests were not that obvious. They were quite limited in the form of financial assistance, particularly because Cyprus joined as a divided island, which meant that all the assistance available to poorer regions was not available to Cyprus, given that the whole of the island of Cyprus joined. Let's be clear about this. So there was no differentiation or delimitation between the south and the north of the island. So the whole of the Republic of Cyprus, the whole of the island of Cyprus joined the European Union. The Republic of Cyprus is basically the island of Cyprus minus the British sovereign areas. Those were those are not Cyprus territories; they are UK territories. But for the Republic of Cyprus, it was very important that the whole territory would join the European Union. And because of the partition line, there were special rules put in place for those areas that were not and still do not fall under the effective control of the government of the Republic of Cyprus, and we can come back to that later. So, as I said, the financial benefits, if you wish, of Cyprus joining the European Union soon turned out in the context of Eurozone membership and sovereign debt crisis. Also, I wanted to point out about Cyprus that Cyprus is the only member state of the European Union who is not a member of NATO, neither a member of the Partnership for Peace. That's something important to reflect on. The same way, Cyprus is not in the Schengen area. Why am I saying for this? Well, the same way. For the Schengen area, strictly speaking, it would be impossible for an EU member state that cannot ensure effective control of its own territory and of the whole territory of the European Union to be able to join the Schengen zone. So the accession negotiations for Cyprus were done very quickly, perhaps a bit too quickly, in the sense that there would have been more space for reforms, particularly in the commercial banking sector. And this is one of the reasons why Cyprus was very hardly hit by the financial crisis, because its banking sector was much bigger than its own public sector, if you wish. And this is how we ended up with a sovereign debt crisis that turned into a banking crisis. But membership to the EU was unconditional, and duties and obligations of Cyprus as a member state are exactly the same as the duties and obligations of any other member states under the founding treaties. The only difference is the special regime put in place alongside the demarcation line or the green line. And this is something we can come back to as a possible inspiration for what could happen elsewhere. I must emphasize that this is a discussion that already took place in the context of Northern Ireland and Brexit, and that back in the days, a few years ago, there was a lot of reluctance to look into Cyprus as a potential model or a potential precedent for Northern Ireland, meaning that if you look at Cyprus as a potential model and precedent, then it is as if we sort of normalize and institutionalize potentially the situation in the north and the invasion of the island. So, of course, the regime for Cyprus, the special regime for Cyprus put in place across the Green Line, was meant to be temporary. Now, 20 years onwards, 20 years of the enlargement, 50 years of military invasion. This is what 2024 is going to mark for Cyprus. So the temporary has become, one shall say, quasi-permanent, and therefore it may be time to think about what was meant to be temporary, and whether the fact that it has become quasi-permanent causes any systemic problems to the way things are functioning. And with that word of caution, we can then, look into the possibility of using Cyprus as a precedent. But I would say, rather as a precedent of using the EU as a soft power, as a security element in the very difficult and almost non-existing Cyprus vis-à-vis Turkey's relations. And Turkey is not a country we have spoken a lot about today, I think only once or twice, but this is a country that we need to speak about. The way we need to speak about Russia and China, and also about the reforms to the enlargement process that Michael was suggesting, as well as Christy was talking about rule of law conditionality. Whatever we may decide that would be the main features of the reform of the EU enlargement process, we would need to have at the back of our minds not only countries like Ukraine, of course, but also countries like Turkey. The other reason why Cyprus is important as a precedent is that by ascertaining EU accession for the Republic of Cyprus, that was a very important way of ascertaining its sovereignty over the occupied part of its territory and anchoring it durably and permanently into the EU and the European project. And again, this is something that is of extreme relevance to Ukraine. And finally, what is interesting for Cyprus, although it's debatable to what extent it has actually happened 20 years onwards, is the role that the European Union could play as a catalyst in the settlement of the Cyprus problem. There again, as I said, more could have been done, but this must be taken into consideration vis-à-vis the triangular relationship of the European Union, Cyprus, and Turkey, particularly because Turkey does not recognize the Republic of Cyprus and does not recognize its airports and ports. So this is one of the, and this time we can use the word conditions, strict conditions that, or red lines that would not actually, let Turkey progress if it ever wanted to progress on its EU enlargement pathway. So at the very least, I think these are the points, I would say, the immediate points, I would say, of comparison with the new wave of enlargement. And I would say the points that are of interest for the countries that are currently looking into the accession process. And so I think that this is an interesting area to talk about. And definitely looking into Cyprus as a model of differentiated integration is something that would be of much assistance. If you wish, we can go on and discuss a little bit about the Green Line regime, but I think I will stop there because I'm sure there'll be questions. Thank you very much. Just to mention that most of what I said will be published in the European Foreign Affairs Review in an article which I wrote together with Dr. Fivos Athanasiou on the 20 years of Cyprus EU integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. You've all been quite lengthy, but I think it was extremely interesting because you've shed light on so many different aspects. And Stephanie, of course, the idiosyncrasies of Cyprus's case are obvious, not just in connection with the Green Line regime, the occupation of the north of the island, and the legal fiction of integrating the entire territory of the island into the European Union, which also played in my mind in this context was, of course, the fourth EU enlargement that never was, which is that of the integration of East Germany into Germany proper, which did not follow type of enlargement process that other Canada countries have been subjected to. That was really the reunification of it, but also the idiosyncrasies of Cyprus in terms of course, the fifth Big Bang enlargement round in 2004. I take note of the fact that indeed, as a member of the Eurozone, vulnerable in its central bank, of course, to the hidden hand of Russia, and large, offshore financial interests by the Russians on the island. Nevertheless, membership of the Eurozone helped Cyprus stay the course, whereas it will remain out of NATO and out of Schengen for reasons that you mentioned. Another reflection in the area of rule of law, as it pertains to some of the other countries that joined in 2004. You mentioned Slovakia. There was, of course, Hungary mentioned several times. The emergency measures which have been taken by autocratic leaning governments in member states during COVID and then prolonged over what still appears to be a migration crisis in the eyes of the government in Budapest. They're of course a prolongation of autocratic tendencies and an erosion of the rule of law to which the EU as a supranational organization does not have an answer. So whether Europeanization as a process can really serve as an antidote to a trend of autocracy is the question, I suppose, rather than the axioma. But and thanks also for referring to Brexit and the Northern Ireland dispute resolution mechanism. That's very helpful. So we have a panoply of issues, of course, on the table. I think what we might focus on with the remainder of our time is really the geopolitical security issue, which has come up as a controversial point in Michael's presentation and picked up both by Christy as well as Stephanie, which also resonates with Miriam Cosmel, who in the Q&A function of Zoom puts an extra layer to this question about a divided Ukraine in asking or saying at first about its potential contribution to the EU's geopolitical role vis-a-vis Russia and also China. When you consider, Michael, Christy, Stephanie, a future dividing line in Ukraine, Christy, you don't, I take that point. Which role do Ukraine's critical resources, rare earth materials, etc., play that supposedly are overwhelmingly in the annexed territory, the occupied territory, and whether you could relate that to the EU's own transition and how the EU has evolved from a coal and steel community to dependencies overseas on other critical raw materials as well. Michael, a few reflections perhaps on the dividing line issue. You posed it as hypothetical, I assume, but maybe also to Miriam's question and points raised by Christy and Stephanie. Michael, you will have to unmute yourself. Please unmute. Isaiah, can you please unmute Michael? Michael, please unmute yourself. This is not working. I apologize for that. Can you please unmute Michael?
Sorry, Stephen. I can't unmute him.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. On the future Ukraine dividing line, the shorthand I used of North-South Korea and then North-South Cyprus, these are the only formula that I feel able to kind of identify and get my mind around. Why North-South Korea, as of today, with Putin still in power, we can't see the feasibility of a negotiated settlement. We've had the experience of the Minsk I, Minsk II so-called agreements that didn't work and were, if you like, fake diplomatic resolutions of the conflicts at that time. We just have to wait until the political and military forces want to call it a stop. It is difficult for us to understand the true strengths and weaknesses of the Russian position. Militarily on the ground at the moment, it seems to be in the ascendancy, but the weaknesses in the underlying Russian position are obviously serious. I mean, we are now way beyond the point of the Ukrainian victory, meaning retaking the entirety of its pre-2014 borders. And if there would be a ceasefire, then the first thing both sides will do will be to build up the defenses, especially on the Ukrainian side, to avoid the scenario in which the Russian side says, let us pause, rebuild our resources, and then move on to take Odessa and the entirety of the Black Sea coast down to and including Moldova. So to put in the defenses to avoid that next conceivable phase, I think is pretty obvious. There's also, Stephanie raised the question of Cyprus, of Turkey. And one of the points that has not otherwise risen by myself or others is how democracies can fight back. We have, of course, had the unexpectedly successful case of Tusk and his party retaking power in Poland, contrary to expectations at the time. We are observing unrest in Hungary now with a new leading opposition figure, possibly building up into something big. And then in Turkey, the last re-election of Erdogan, well, he got it, but only just. And the opposition parties rallied together and did a pretty credible job. And the recent city elections have underlined that, which actually brings us also to the Georgia case. So we are watching on the television these days the demonstrations in protest against the foreign agents law. Whenever I meet Georgians these days, I ask them, are your opposition parties getting their act together, taking example indeed from both Turkey and Poland recently as to how disparate opposition parties could coalesce and win. We don't hear anything like that yet happening in Georgia, but the demonstrations in the street seem to be quite impressive. So we have to watch this space. Of course, if Georgia did indeed, in the autumn of this year, when they have a general election, if they succeed in throwing out the Georgian dream, then this would renew Georgia's place as a somewhat credible accession candidate compared to the political fiction of today.
Christy, battlefield dynamics are what they are. There may be a swing moment in favor of Ukraine, so there's no way of knowing yet how the war will end. Do you think member states, you alluded to them, to their political leaders having come around to basically militarily defeating Russia, do you think they've boxed themselves in, or would they be amenable to a type of negotiated settlement if realities prevail?
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. So this really is turning into a discussion on Ukraine for a very good reason, because that is so crucial for the EU's future and Europe's future. Let me take first one step back and just make clear what is at stake. We talk about now the EU as this newly emerged geopolitical actor. And what is at the heart of this geopolitical fight that is going on in Ukraine, it is the future of European security order. And what is the goal of the EU in this fight? I think it is to defend the rules-based order, to secure sustainable security in Europe, which then also is a precondition for securing and protecting democracy and the rule of law and the rest of the European values. So there is so much at stake. And where the EU is still weak as a geopolitical actor, of course, one aspect is military force, hard power, but then also strategic thinking is something that is evolving, but the EU is not showing itself as particularly strong. And I think this discussion is kind of an example here. What is the strategic goal of the EU with regard to Ukraine? It cannot be to achieve a ceasefire line next year if there is no credible path and resources and way how to get there. As you said, Stephen, we don't know what the outcome of the war will be. So my point is not to say that there will be no dividing line. We can't know. Maybe there will be. Maybe it will be worse than that. Maybe Ukraine will lose the war. It can happen. But what I want to stress is that we, the West, the EU, Ukraine, we should have our strategic goals very clearly in mind. We should be aware of what it means if we don't reach these goals. And then we should consider much more hard and have a much stronger sense of urgency in thinking about what more we can do to move towards the goals. It depends on our actions in the EU also on what is going to be the outcome of this fight. And,
isn't then the consequence, Christy, that the EU has no other choice but to build up its military muscle so that it can provide the type of security guarantees which you claim it cannot offer, it cannot currently offer?
Then the question of security guarantees, it's about how to organize that and what is the institutional framework for doing it. In the end, actually, the most important question with regard to Europe's future defense capability is what European states are doing. Because in the end, it's about national decisions, how much countries invest in their defense capability. And then the framework for defense plans and the command structure, that is now in NATO. And just to give you an example that illustrates the importance of NATO, it's the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. Why did they do it after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? It's because they felt that they need this security guarantee, that the EU was not giving that. And why Ukraine is aiming at membership in both the EU and NATO. So in the end, it boils down to what European countries do. And then they have the EU framework and the NATO framework. These are for doing different types of things. The EU has its own role. But it's all about increasing Europe's ability to take care of its own security and defense. And then also its ability to help Ukraine. And I want to note where I fully agree with Michael. I don't think with Putin's regime there can be a stable negotiated settlement. But then also Michael alluded to Russia's perhaps underlying weakness, although at the moment Russia seems, or it has the initiative on the battleground and it is of course militarily superior to Ukraine, but it is not at all superior to the collective forces of the EU and NATO. And the kind of fundament of the Russian regime is anything but strong, really. It's pretty rotten. And that's one factor just to keep in mind when we look forward to this continuing struggle, that we are fighting against a regime which is becoming totalitarian, which is kind of in its foundation actually very fragile. And we have to have confidence in the kind of superiority of the system that we have in the EU and in the West in this fight. So this is like the big strategic picture. And then very quickly on Ukraine's contribution to the geopolitical Europe, that was in the questions. There is a huge potential, and of course we have been analyzing with Stephen this question of potential implications of Ukraine's EU membership. We really have to see in the EU Ukraine as a future asset for European security. It's yes, because of the critical raw materials. It's also because of its fast developing defense industry. It's because of the contribution it can make to global food security. So there are so many elements there that really point to Ukraine making the EU a much stronger geopolitical actor in future. But then first there is the war to be ended in a way that actually brings us sustainable security.
Thanks, Christy. I'm conscious of time and the poor timekeeping on my part. Apologies for that, but I'd be remiss to not to offer Stephanie a few parting thoughts as well. I wanted to focus your mind a little bit more on Turkey still. Stephanie, you rightly mentioned it. Michael said there are 9 candidate countries. Formally, there are 10, of course, with Turkey, the Western Balkan 6, the Eastern Trio, and Turkey. But it's a rather peculiar candidate country for the EU, and it's a rather peculiar ally in NATO with its so-called multi-vector foreign policy, of course, allowing itself departures that no other allies allow themselves, and including pinpricks into Cyprus's economic and exclusive economic zone, rather, with gas explorations and the like. So, you know, with friends or allies like that, who needs enemies? Do you think the European Union and the regime it's put in place, which is regulatory in nature primarily, okay, financial as well, as you mentioned, through Eurozone membership, is sufficient, you know, if Erdogan, as a cat in a corner, jumps out in unexpected ways, which coincidentally is a topic, you know, that we may want to consider in our Reunir project. I mean, we're not just talking about malign influences of Russia and in China. We're talking about the potential havoc that Turkey could create as well. So, rather broad question. I'm aware, Stephanie, but perhaps you could offer us some parting thoughts, also in line with the previous security discussion we've had so far.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, while I was listening to all that was being said, what I was thinking is the question, or maybe the misunderstanding, is about, you know, how much the European Union can do. So in the case of Cyprus, or with a neighbor like Turkey, the conflict predated EU accession. So in that sense, given that at the point of Cyprus's accession into the European Union, Turkey was also trying to negotiate its own candidacy status with the European Union, let's say that there was a momentum there where the EU could actually play a meaningful role, and not only the EU member states, as Christy rightly pointed out. But in the case of Ukraine, you have a completely different setting, which is, I'm wondering what sort of role we expect the EU to play. And I agree with Christy that here, you know, the role of the European Union in the settlements of a potential ceasefire or a potential end to the war will be very limited, unless we beef up this European defense and military initiative. Now, living with a neighbor like Russia or like Turkey is very problematic. That is the reason why smaller countries or weaker countries value EU membership or indeed membership in any other international organization, with the limitations that we know. Turkey is clearly opposing any membership by Cyprus to any other international organization. And any such move could, damage the already difficult balancing exercise and dynamics. So, in fact, Michael mentioned in Cyprus that it is a, peaceful demarcation line, which is right. It is a peaceful demarcation line. It is only a demarcation line and not a border. So we are not talking about, hard borders. We are not talking about two different jurisdictions and two different countries, of course. And this is the reason why it was used in the context of the discussion about Northern Ireland, because it's the same there. You can have no hard border. So it is, in that sense, an interesting question to look at. But it remains that having Turkey as a neighbor, despite the peacefulness and, the current stakes, whether these are economic stakes, geographical or geopolitical, is an everyday struggle, which needs to be taken into account. Now, what Turkey and Russia have in common is that they are not interested in the European pathway. Russia very clearly was never interested, and Turkey is not interested anymore. Now, a change perhaps of leadership, as Michael was indicating, in Turkey could see a resurgence of Turkey's interest for EU accession, which would, of course, in such cases, facilitate the situation in Cyprus. But just to come back to the question that was asked by Miriam about rare resources, the same thing happened in Cyprus. I mean, the best beaches and the most beautiful landscapes and cities of Cyprus are in the occupied areas. So this gives leverage to an organization like the European Union to try to assist financially and otherwise the infrastructures in the occupied areas, if you want, to come up to a similar level of development as what you can see in the Republic of Cyprus. But that can only come after there has been either a ceasefire line or some sort of a status quo, some sort of a settlement. And I agree with Christy that I don't see the role currently, the current role that the European Union can play in that status quo, whether it is with Turkey or whether it is with Ukraine. More so with Ukraine, that is an active conflict, rather than Cyprus, that is a passive conflict. Anyway, there's much more we could discuss, but I think we'll have to stop there.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Indeed, we have more than exhausted our time, but it was a fascinating discussion. I would like to thank, of course, Michael for preparing the ground with a paper which is already online with Daniel Gross on the website of CEPS, and then the draft paper on democracy, which we have discussed, but which will be finalized and then eventually published. I want to thank, of course, Christy Reich for her brilliant intervention, 360 view on Estonia's pathway prior to accession and all the way in supporting Ukraine on its membership path, and of course Stephanie also, Stephanie Lole-Chelou, for her insights into the unique case of Cyprus. hopefully it will be resolved as a unique case and normalize over time and not be replicated in the future of enlargement. Well, we are in the problem structuring phase of Reunir. I think our audience, half of whom are still with us, despite the poor timekeeping on my part, will be interested in seeing how our research may contribute to evolved insights and all of this. Stay tuned, and we will look forward to welcoming you for our future events. Thank you so much on your behalf to all of our panelists, and see you soon. Bye-bye.